Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Two heavyweight cards for Matchroom and DAZN have been announced. Otto Wallin and Dillian Whyte for the 30th of October, and Joseph Parker and Derek Chisora, the rematch. So see here on screen, this is a press release from Matchroom and DAZN. Obviously Matchroom recently joining DAZN full-time, so cards here that are going to be in the United Kingdom but broadcast mostly around the world. Except for Parker Chisora 2, so bad news for New Zealand fans, it will not be on DAZN, but I guess as New Zealand fans you've come to expect Joseph Parker pay-per-view prices. So anyway, the press release a little bit thin, just sort of goes through the cursory details. It's more a press release about the schedule as opposed to each individual fight and going into any real depth. A couple of comments from DAZN and Eddie Hearn. It does note the price increase for UK and Ireland subscribers going up to £7.99 or €7.99 in Ireland. So obviously a bit of a jump there. And other parts of the world, I'm assuming, apart from the United States, that most places are still on that introductory lower price. But anyway, what we'll do is we'll get to a couple of the social media postings from some of the fighters involved, and then on to a couple of quick thoughts, just initial thoughts here, further videos to come later down the line. So Dillian Whyte, a couple of postings. So here with the graphic saying Whyte vs Wallin, October 30th, live at the O2. It's going to be a scary night for Wallin. I've not boxed at home in front of crowds in nearly 2 years. I'm ready to go to war. Hashtag Dillian Whyte, hashtag body snatcher. Whyte in another post with a sort of a video, but I won't risk playing that for fear of copyright. He says, it's time to go to war again at the O2 London. Welcome to my city at Otto Wallin. See you soon, boy, and a bunch of hashtags, etc. Wallin with his own graphic, and not the official one, it doesn't look like, but saying, my time is now, October 30, hashtag all in Wallin. And then a couple of adding different people like DAZN and his own promoter, Dimitri Salita. Then we go to Derek Chisora, who has a phrase, because he actually had two different postings here, and it's a pretty cool graphic, although somewhat inaccurate because Joseph Parker from New Zealand, not Australia, but that's some of Derek Chisora's terrible banter that he's been running with right from the first fight. But he's got a Latin adage here, which he's put up another post, I should say, where it is actually explained. I did actually go to Google Translate to have a look at that, but he's done the work for us here. If you want peace, prepare for war. Joseph Parker, at the time of this video, which I recorded 8 AM New Zealand time, no posting, so that's a little unusual given the fight's been public and announced for several hours now. But anyway, first things first, Dillian Whyte and Otto Wallin. Not a bad fight. Dillian Whyte initially earlier this year was intending to go to the United States. He had a goal of fighting at a slightly lower than where he'd been, but then he opted to stay in the United Kingdom, and names of Chris Arreola, Jermaine Franklin, and also Andy Ruiz were talked about. Ultimately, none of those materialized. They've gone for Otto Wallin. And some of that, no doubt, has come down to they needed someone with some name recognition, someone that subscribers and UK casual fans, that sort of stuff, could latch on to and go, yeah, I know that guy. Oh, yeah, I remember he fought Tyson Fury. So I'm sure some of that has sort of fed into this, and DAZN probably bulked it. The option of Jermaine Franklin, who is pretty unknown to anyone not a heavyweight boxing fan. So Otto Wallin does have a bit more sort of broader, sort of casual awareness compared to Jermaine Franklin. Chris Arreola, apparently that was the original target, but they couldn't secure a deal with him. But not surprising, he was PBC. And I know some people have said, isn't Otto Wallin with PBC? No, he is not. He's not a PBC fighter. He's with Dimitri Salita. Salita sometimes has his own shows on Showtime. Sometimes his fighters have been on PBC cards, but that does not mean he is signed with PBC. So I just wanted to clear that up. So him, Jermaine Franklin, who's in the same stable, can travel, go different places. They can be that sort of good B-side when someone is looking for an opponent. And this is the sort of Johnny-on-the-spot type position for Otto Wallin that I think he was hoping to capitalize on sooner after that Tyson Fury fight, because he has struggled to get fights since then, the sort of fights that he wanted to be in. He did have a fight against Dominic Breazeale, his last fight out, made mincemeat out of Breazeale, picked him apart, and ultimately got a pretty comfortable win there. Dillian Whyte has obviously just come off a win over an Alexander Povetkin in their rematch. He was iced in the first fight a year ago, defeated him earlier this year, and now he is going to be facing Otto Wallin on DAZN. So this is not a pay-per-view fight, so I'm sure DAZN would have had a certain level of fight in mind and a certain amount of money that they're willing to pay for different opponents. And Whyte, it might have been a reality if he wanted a certain amount of money, he had to face a guy at a certain level. So Otto Wallin is a good opponent. He's bigger than Whyte, he's a southpaw, he's a good mover, he's a good technician, and this could be quite an awkward fight for Whyte. I sort of said in the previous video where this sort of came up as an option because Otto Wallin sort of came out of nowhere, then it was reported that the fight was about to be made, and now it's made. And it's actually better than the Jermaine Franklin fight in my view, but stylistically it's more tricky for Whyte as well. He hasn't really been facing southpaws of late, and Otto Wallin has got the height, he's got the... I'm not sure about Otto Wallin's reach, but Dillian Whyte has a reach of 78 inches. It's probably going to be something similar to Otto Wallin, but certainly Wallin has a couple of inches on him. And we've seen before that against guys who can box and move, who are good movers, Dillian Whyte can sometimes be made to look a little plodding. So it wouldn't surprise me if Otto Wallin starts quite strong against Dillian Whyte. You may recall Joseph Parker in their fight a couple of years back. The first couple of rounds, especially the opening round before the sort of head clash where Parker ended up sort of hitting the deck, he was outboxing Dillian Whyte and making it look like Whyte was moving in slow motion. I'm not saying that Wallin's going to be doing it to that same extent because he doesn't quite have the same sort of speed as Parker, but I could totally see Otto Wallin on the back of the jab, using movement, using the ring, outpointing Dillian Whyte early on and sweeping some of those early rounds. It could be somewhat, close and competitive, but Otto Wallin landing the cleaner work, landing more work, but Otto Wallin has tired in a number of fights. So I know from the previous comment section of the video mentioning this fight, a lot of people were starting to think that Otto Wallin, he could maybe pull this off. This could be something that he could get to a decision, he could get a win here, and that is certainly a possibility. But one of the things that has been a feature of some of his more recent fights, the ones that have gone longer, he does tire in fights. We saw that against Dominic Breazeale as well. He really was fading down the stretch. But so too with Dillian Whyte. Sometimes he can tire in fights. Most notably, he was on his last legs against Joseph Parker, barely able to stand up by the end of that round, but of the 12th round, I should say. But I could totally see a situation where Wallin starts strong, banks some rounds, but Dillian Whyte starts to come more into the fight as Otto Wallin starts to tire a bit. The movement's not as slick. He becomes more hittable. And potentially he could get clipped. He could get dropped. He could get taken out. But in the same breath, I could totally also see this going the distance as well. Otto Wallin has demonstrated a good chin. So I like this fight for a number of reasons, and it's not an easy touch. But it is a little bit funny that Dillian Whyte had previously criticized Tyson Fury for facing a guy like Otto Wallin. And at the time I said, look, Wallin against Fury, it wasn't just a gimme fight. Otto Wallin was a good heavyweight, and it was going to be tougher than many people expected. And he did come better than advertised, ultimately opening a couple of cuts on Fury through punches, and that ended up being quite a sort of tough fight for Fury in the sense that he was trying to obviously deal with that injury, and the guy in front of him ultimately got the decision comfortably enough. But it was trickier than people expected, and that did sort of surprise people. But Whyte has criticized Wallin before, and I'm sure Wallin wouldn't have forgotten that. But now these two are facing each other. It's an interesting fight, and it is for Dillian Whyte's WBC Interim Championship. So we'll move on to the other fights here. You've got Joseph Parker versus Derek Chisora, the rematch. So these guys fought earlier in 2021. I don't know how I sort of feel about this fight, because the first fight, Yeah, it was okay, but it was a sort of a tale of two halves. But also, it's one of these sort of situations. Joseph Parker in just recent years hasn't been up to much there with the tune-ups. Then he sort of had a sort of ugly fight with Junior Fa, and to some extent that fight with Chisora, he didn't really sort of excel and separate himself. And actually, in some people's minds, he was lucky to get the decision. It was a close fight. He was the one that was dropped in the first 10 seconds of it. Derek Chisora put up 6 good rounds and then basically started to fade. He gassed badly, but Parker, sort of racking up some rounds later in the fight, had an opportunity to sort of, put it on Chisora a couple of points late in the fight. For some reason, didn't do it when he actually had Chisora hurt. And there has been, in recent years, Parker's not really delivering. He's not sort of measuring up to where people think he should be performing and the stuff that he should be doing. So it is sort of one of these cases. I'm not completely enthused about the fight. It is interesting to a degree, but I'm hoping that there's a better performance. And it's another fight that he's got under his belt, that first one, with his new trainer, Andy Lee. So maybe some of the changes or adjustments that they've been making will bed in. But there is also the sort of thing with his elbows. It's one of these things, it's a chronic injury that he's had for a few years now. Obviously, he had surgery back in 2017 on both elbows. He's had cleanup procedures since. And you may recall, I think it was the 11th round of that fight with Chisora. After the fight, because David Higgins, Parker's former promoter and current advisor / manager, was asked, well, why didn't Parker put it on Chisora? And there was sort of some mixed messaging about why that was, and some references to the elbows, and it was just a little sort of odd. But I do wonder, and I've mentioned this in a Patreon video before, what sort of extent is that injury actually impacting Parker? It's because, having that chronic injury for so long. Because I don't think Parker's as fast as he was. He's still got some good speed, but you do see him slowing down pretty quickly in fights in terms of the speed front. But are we going to get something that we're going to like to see this time in terms of a spectacle? Because the first fight, it was okay. The second fight, and I've already seen online, especially on Twitter, some people just absolutely sort of, taking a dump on this fight, not looking forward to seeing it. And I guess there is something to be said about having fresh opponents, fresh fights. Do we really need to see the rematch? That's a question. How much interest is there for the rematch? And obviously, if you're in New Zealand, you're going to be paying for it as well, probably $40. But Derek Chisora, we know what he's about. He already knows that he can have success against Joseph Parker. He knows he can drop him. He knows he can put it on him. And those body shots, he was really taking out of Joseph Parker in that first fight. But at this point, Derek Chisora, 37 years old and 11 losses under the belt. He's got a lot of miles on the clock. He's kind of fought a who's who in the heavyweight division. He is at the tail end of his career. He's not in his prime, but he can still put up 6 good rounds, as we've seen both in the Usyk fight and also that first Parker fight. Parker is one of these guys who's sort of failed to impress in recent years, and I think people are wondering what's he got left. Is Joseph Parker, can he sort of prove that he believes that he is part of that sort of elite level of heavyweights? And I know that there are some sanctioning bodies. I know the Ring, for example, has Parker at number 4 in the world. I think based on what we've seen since the losses to Joshua and Whyte, 3 tune-ups and a win over Junior Fa and Derek Chisora, I think that's a bit inflated. But he can certainly prove me wrong. He can certainly put on a good performance and prove to people that he's still, potentially a force in the heavyweight division. I'm just kind of got a few question marks about where he's really at, because Chisora is a gatekeeper to the world level. And sure, he gives people tough fights and no one really sort of blows by him too much. But I think Parker needs to put a more decisive performance in here to prove, that he's still a guy that can vie for a heavyweight title and have potential success. What do you make of it all? Parker versus Chisora 2, also Whyte and Wallin. Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.